Good evening, folks, and welcome to the Wheeler Centre. Lovely to see such a healthy crowd on a Friday evening. My name's Jenny Niven. I'm the Associate Director and Head of Programming here at the Wheeler Centre, and I'm delighted to be joined by Jacinta Halloran on the far end, Steven Amsterdam and Toni Jordan. If you could please join me in welcoming our guests. Welcome. So, Jacinta Halloran is a Melbourne GP and writer. She's written on medical topics for a wide variety of publications, including the Sunday Age and Inside Story. Her first novel, Dissection, was shortlisted for the Victorian Premier's Literary Prize for an unpublished manuscript and was published by Scribe in 2008. She's also had short stories published in The Pen and the Stethoscope and New Australian Stories too. Her second novel, which we'll be discussing in a bit of detail tonight, Pilgrimage, was just recently published. September, was it?
August.
Yeah. Steven Amsterdam is a writer and palliative care nurse. There is a link here, although I don't know if we'll discuss that this evening. Steven's first book, Things We Didn't See Coming, won the Age Book of the Year award and was longlisted for the Guardian First Book Award. His latest book, What the Family Needed, was called Ingenious by Australian Book Review and was very recently shortlisted for the Dublin Impact.
The long list. The very long list.
Still.
It's a nice. I'm just being on a list with Stephen King is enough. So.
It's a prestigious prize. It's wonderful. Toni Jordan is the author of Addition, Fall Girl and 9 Days. Her debut novel, Addition, was shortlisted for the Barbara Jeffreys Award and longlisted for the Miles Franklin in 2009, and it's been published in 16 countries. Her second novel, Fall Girl, was published in 2010 and followed by 9 Days, also in August of this year. So the idea for tonight's panel actually came from the fact that the Lonely Planet have recently published this lovely little book called Better Than Fiction, and it just kind of spurred it's a collection of stories by fiction writers who are musing on travel. So they're not necessarily travel writers, and the only one of our three writers who's in that particular collection is Steven. But it got us thinking a little bit about the impact of travel on creative people and what it means to go to other places and think about yourself in relation to that, what it means for creativity. So if you're here to think about trekking through the Amazon or to hear people talk about going off to the Arctic Circle in canoes, you're probably in the wrong place. That's not the sort of discussion we'll have tonight. But if you're interested in hearing from three fabulous writers who've all explored the world and explored their own creativity in lots of interesting different ways, then I think you're in for a bit of a treat. Jacinta, perhaps we can... I'd like to first start by just talking about the immediate connection between travel and your own work for each of the three of you. So perhaps you can start us off by giving us a bit of the background on Pilgrimage and what was the genesis for that story.
Well, it really occurred a confluence of things. I'd just finished editing my first novel, Dissection, and I felt like a bit of a holiday after that, all that hard work. And at that time I received an email from someone who since went on to co-curate the Love and Devotion exhibition around the corner at the State Library. And she sent me this beautiful email just sort of, by the way, I'm off to Transylvania, to the Black Church in Brasov to look at a collection of Ottoman textiles. It's set in the Carpathian Mountains. And I just thought, well, God, I've got to go there. I mean, that's just on the plate, So I have a very intrepid friend, and she said, I'll come with you. So we just, within a little while, we set off to go to Romania, to Transylvania, none less. And it was a perfect place to set a book, I must say. But I always also had the gist of a story about family dynamics and terminal illness and religious belief. And so I sort of transplanted those ideas to Romania. And it all sort of came together, yeah.
And what was it about that particular place that made you think this is where I've got to set a book?
Yeah, well, it's really very picturesque. It's certainly Transylvania is really rather a beautiful area, mountains and beautiful forests, deciduous forests, and very fairy tale towns with, you know, incredibly beautiful wooden churches and turreted buildings, and Dracula's castles that is there as well. So very picturesque, but also incredibly remote in lots of ways. I mean, we didn't speak Romanian, and there weren't a lot of people who spoke English. It's not terribly touristed. There's a sort of a repressive feel still from the terrible years of the Ceausescu regime. He was sort of assassinated in about 91, I think, and they're still recovering from that. You can see mentally, I think they're still really recovering from that terribly repressive era. And so there was a sense of a different ambience, a different sort of mindset, where I imagined that a religious belief could really be something that was incredibly important to the people. And I since discovered that despite the communist era, there was a lot of people who really, you know, fought hard to keep religious belief strong, the churches open, and those sort of things. So I think it just ended up suiting the ideas and themes behind my novel very well as a setting.
Sorry, Stephen.
Well, did you go there searching for, like, I have this idea for a book, but I don't quite have it anchored, and then having that experience of everything I see, you know, provides me with what I need, or did it just crystallize there for you?
I think that you sort of, I guess you have ideas, and then well, when I went there, I suppose I took what I wanted from it to fit perhaps my vague sort of original ideas. But there were certainly added bonuses. I mean, I met wonderful people, very sort of enigmatic characters that I hadn't sort of expected to meet, and I guess I used them too in my writing. So I think I was very lucky. I just happened to choose the right place at the right time. I mean, had I gone somewhere else, it may not have worked as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But part of the plot, it's a middle-aged woman whose mother is diagnosed with, is it motor neuron disease?
Yes, motor neuron disease.
And I'm not giving away any spoilers because this happens very early in the book, but she decides that she's going to go on this pilgrimage, and there's a bit of a battle between sort of faith and medicine and things that come out of that. So, I mean, it's the perfect metaphor, really, isn't it, for a journey, a self-discovery as well as a literal journey. And
I don't want to be too cliched, but it's sort of the journey in my book that's important, not the destination, as they say. And I think in more ways than one, that's really borne out, in terms of the character arc and the character's realisations or self-realisations and relationships, how they alter throughout the journey. Yeah.
It was partly based, or it was inspired by, there is a real kind of pilgrimage in that area, isn't there? The Medjugorje.
Yes, well, I did use the internet, which is a wonderful thing once you're at home and you're saying, now, where was that place and what did it look like? But there is a real pilgrimage site in Bosnia, a village somewhere in Bosnia where there are supposedly visitations of the Virgin Mary, and that's a very much part of the Catholic pilgrimage now, although the church is a little bit iffy about it, but the Catholics still go there. And so I used a lot of those ideas for my sort of fictitious pilgrimage site in Romania. Though I could sort of imagine someone going to Romania on a pilgrimage. It's sort of got all the elements of mystery and intrigue and very fairy tale, and so it sort of worked.
Believe it or not, this June I was in Dubrovnik on my honeymoon, and we'd flown there from Scotland where we got married, and on the way back there was a whole pilgrimage who'd been at Medjugorje because the nearest airport was actually Dubrovnik. They'd driven back down, and they were from this town Kilmarnock. I don't know if anybody knows where that is on the west coast of Scotland, which is not a mystical fairy tale sort of a place. There's a lady in the middle going And it was really surprising. They'd gone on this very kind of classic sort of pilgrimage, and I was sitting next to these two people on the way back, and they were hysterical because they were really concerned about the alcohol allowance and did you get your Benson and Hedges, and it was this. But they talked to me about how everybody, they were in this big group. It was a church group, and there'd been a tour group who'd gone to the church and promised all kinds of things, and people had fundraised in the community, and off they all went together, and it was just extraordinary.
What did they think of their experience?
They had a fabulous time, and they felt Our Lady was around all the time, it was a really
sort of religious tourism or something.
Your novel goes into how, at the beginning, when the main character Celeste goes off to talk to the priest about this, because she's quite sceptical, isn't she?
Yeah, she's very sceptical. She's a doctor who lapsed Catholic, so they're the most sceptical. They're vehemently sceptical.
And she was quite sort of concerned that the mother was being invested with false hope. And
yes, exactly, yeah. And she goes to her local priest, who she hasn't seen for a long time, to sort of see what he's been telling her mother about this pilgrimage site in Romania. And it's really quite surprising to her in the end, because the priest doesn't really tout the virtues of this site and how wonderful it is and how her mother will definitely be cured. What he really says is, wouldn't it be nice for you and your sister to go on a journey with your mother? So in fact, he's sort of encouraging her just to spend the time and just to support her mother, which is what she ends up doing. Yeah.
And what was it about that unusual setting that allowed you to explore the relationships between the characters that you might not have been able to do if they were all just in their own natural setting or in their own living room?
Yeah, I think that was really important to the novel, that, and I don't know if you feel this when you travel, that once you're removed from your own comfort zone and your own sort of routine, where you don't have to really examine a lot of things about your life on a daily basis, you start to be a bit objective about what you're doing and where you've come from, and you feel you feel removed from your daily routine. You can look at it sort of objectively, and certainly it enabled, being in this strange place enabled my character to look very, very much from a long distance at her life, of which she has a lot of regrets, and to look at her relationship with her partner, and to look at some of the sadness in her life that she's still grieving. And also it enabled her to go back and think about her past and her sort of slightly traumatic childhood. And so I think the vehicle of travelling and being in a different place, really, as a writer, it was a good conceit for what I was trying to do in the novel, was to look back and to re-examine. Yeah.
Thank you. Toni, sorry, I'll just skip round this way. I wanted I hope we're not going to upset your publisher, but I would love you to talk a little bit about the book that's coming out next, because you had a very interesting kind of research process.
This is the problem, Jenny. I'm a complete fraud, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here talking about travel and how it relates to our work, and I've published 3 books, and the first one was set in Glen Iris, and the second one was set in North Ball, and the third one was set in Richmond. So I'm not really sure I'm the best person, but I have lately spent 3 months in Beijing on a residency that's called an Asia Link residency. It's a body associated with the Uni of Melbourne, and they tee up with overseas institutions, sort of writer exchanges almost. So I was at Peking University, which is in Beijing, and I spent 3 months there. And I love the confidence with which Jenny says the book that's coming out next.
Of course it is.
You sort of, in order to get this fantastic experience of this 3 months overseas, you need to obviously put forward a project, the kind of thing that the idea is, the reason you're going there. And I had a really clear idea about what I wanted to do when I wrote this proposal, which was, I've never lived anywhere but Australia. I haven't travelled very much, but I had an idea for a character who had had a stroke and at the time it was a sort of a youngish boy actually who had a stroke as in the womb, and he couldn't speak, he couldn't make himself understood, and he was mute really. And so I did a lot of research on this condition like aphasia, people who couldn't communicate verbally, and then I thought, well, really what I need to do is be in a city where I can't communicate verbally. So that's the plan that I put forward. So I have got this novel on the go, and I've done maybe 15 or 20,000 words of this that I wrote when I was there, and it really is an amazing experience for a writer, because you're forced to be on the outside. I couldn't talk, like my Mandarin is just rubbish. I did a little course before I went, and it's like incomprehensible language. You go there and I can't believe that people can understand each other. But clearly they can. But you're forced to be on the outside. Where I was staying, very few people spoke English. So I was, on the train, I couldn't understand people. I couldn't understand, there was only one newspaper, which was kind of the government propaganda thing with how great China is, Japan are devils kind of stories, US are devils too kind of stories. And I really felt this, it's that standing on the outside business that really enables you to think about having experiences for the first time. There's a lot of that going on, and there's a lot of, you're forced to watch people because you can't interact with them, so you're stuck on the outside as an observer, and to me that was really fascinating. So I worked on that novel for the first maybe 6 weeks, and then I got an idea for another novel, this time actually set in China, so I did a bit of work on that. So I've kind of got 2 bits of novels, and we'll see what happens.
I know, I totally jumped the gun because we spoke before you went off to Beijing, and I was just fascinated by the idea of your proposal about how you would use that experience to write a character. Yeah, it was it really, really struck me.
And it's quite amazing that words, I didn't really realise this because I'm a very kind of verbal person, but you really don't need that many words to get along, and it's so much of it is non-verbal. I really hadn't realised, You can tell when I had one instance where there's a little corner kiosk not far from the apartment that I would pass when I got off the train, and it's summer, so it's really hot, and I wanted an ice cream, and I hadn't got the door open, but I was standing over the ice cream kind of freezer thing looking, because I couldn't figure out what even the ice creams were. Like the yellow ones, is that pineapple, is that lemon, how do you... And the kiosk lady was just so infuriated with this, that I was making this big decision out of an ice cream, that she just opened the drawer, got out anyone, shut it, and just gave it to me like, that's your ice cream. And she just thought I was the biggest idiot around. And you can tell the way people interact with you. You really don't need that many words. You can order in a restaurant by just sort of sign language, like, and you can really get by with surprisingly few.
Yeah. So I didn't know that you've come up with another project while you've been there. How did that happen? Was it just that the environment overtook the other project?
I think it did. I think that as you settle into a place, it's the kind of, and the people who run these residencies are very aware of that. It's almost impossible to say, I'm going to go to a foreign country and this is what I'm going to do, because part of the experience of being there is having other ideas that you would not otherwise have. So they're very kind of flexible about the work that you do. But also what I did when I was there is read a lot of Chinese literature in translation that people I'd never heard of. And one of their classics of Chinese literature is this book called Dream of the Red Chamber, and it's like almost like Don Quixote kind of thing for Chinese people, very early, enormous. Like I only read the first third, so I only got up to page 850. And it's all about life in imperial China, and I started to think about how difficult that would be to translate something like that. And I started to think about the whole idea of translation. So now I'm thinking about this main character who's a translator. And it's quite a different project again, but I never would have come up with the idea if I hadn't gone. So.
And do you think that experience, that immersion in Beijing has that changed your writing style?
Definitely.
As well as it has?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's a lot of things going on when you're really absorbed in a place, because partly when you walk the streets that you know well, like I've lived in Melbourne now for 15 years, and I think I know it pretty well. And when I walk the streets, only part of you is kind of there at the moment, and other parts of you are thinking of things that happened last time you were in that place, you know. So you walk past the State Library and you go, oh yeah, I'm here, but oh, I remember that time that I was walking past and they had this legalised marijuana parade with all these kind of stoners with signs, and how funny that was. And so you're not actually in the present, because part of your mind is back on other times that you've been in that same place, or other thoughts you've had when you've been in that place before. And when you're in somewhere for the first time, especially somewhere kind of wild, you're forced to be, it anchors you in a way that nothing else really does. You're forced to be there because you see things, oh my goodness, is that a live fish like flapping there on the street in front of that house? And they just put it there for a minute. And you know, is that child going to run out onto the road? And everything is so new that it sort of grounds you in a way that nothing else does, I think. And I was able to almost get out of my head in one respect and into the actual experiences that were going on around me in a really vivid and visceral sense.
And you think that's infused the way that you
Very
write
much,
too?
yeah. It's taught me to be a better observer. It's taught me to really focus on the things that are happening in front of you. And also there's a peace that comes from not overhearing anything, not being able to eavesdrop, not understanding the advertising hoardings, not reading the person's, you know, newspaper on the train over their shoulder. It's quite like a little bubble. So it's a really different experience than just sitting in your familiar environment coming up with things.
And it's kind of a sort of diminished responsibility in a way as well, isn't it? Because
Yeah,
you're sort of
that's right.
passive and yet active all of the time. But,
It's really, I think every writer should be plucked up and just popped somewhere completely at random. And it's worth remembering that to us, for me, Beijing was an incredibly foreign environment, but for other people, here is a foreign environment. So the 3 books that I've had that have all been published internationally, my first book edition set in Glen Iris, the one that's sold in the 16 countries, people love that overseas. And my Italian agent, who lives in Milan, said to me on the phone, Glen Iris, it sounds so exotic. So you know, it's not that there's anything particularly inherently weird about these places. It's just not. It's just different
it's
from
the
ours.
other and the different.
It's the other.
Isn't
That's
it? Yeah.
right.
We might come back to place a little bit more, but Stephen, your experience is a bit different because you're a sort of perennial expat in a way, aren't you? Could you want to?
Moved around.
Yeah, he said casually. Yeah, well, I didn't actually know until right before our session that you used to be a map editor too. I think in some ways you probably have some more traditional experiences with travel writing than perhaps our other 2 guests do. Do you want to start there?
Oh, well, my first job, was my first job? Yeah, I think my first job was in book publishing with Penguin, had a series of travel guides. And I was told later that I was hired because I had two hands and 2 feet. But I fell into maps, and I really liked maps, and there's very concrete, sort of the opposite of the stuff we've been talking about. And a map editor to answer maps in travel guides change every year because hotel names change, street names change, governments fall. So there's always some updating to do. And so that was my job for a long time, but on the side I picked up where I would edit Chicago or Java. And so I used that as a tool really to get some travel.
And during that time you were in New York City, is that
That was
right?
when I was living in New York.
Yeah, yeah. So the story that you have in this particular collection, in the Lonely Planet one, is kind of an anti-travel narrative in a way. I mean,
Say more.
I mean, it's you're in Indonesia, so you're in a sort of spur of the moment kind of mood. You go off and do a journey that you wouldn't otherwise have been prompted to take. Although already at the beginning of the story, you're still in, is it Yogyakarta or somewhere in Java? And then off you go to Sulawesi. But then, do you want to tell us what happens?
Well, it's just,
It's
I
a very
don't know,
fun-
but I'm curious about this anti-travel thing, but it was really, it's almost a bad medicine story. It was, there's a anti-malarial medicine that figures in two of the narratives in this book that was for sale for a while, and one of the side effects was psychosis, and that kind of made the vividness of travel. And so the kind of the high point for me is me crawling around my hotel room on the floor on my hands and knees trying to find where the children's Christian choir was, because I knew it was somewhere in the room. So, I mean, I sort of premedicated in high school, so I had some idea that something was afoot, but I was able to sort through it and survive, and that was kind of a tale of survival, and just all the random things that can happen to you when you travel, whether you're spur of the moment or whether you got this tight itinerary. Things get in the way, and you don't. What I'm thinking of is really early on, when I was probably a teenager, I sat next to some guy on the plane who kept giving me advice for the whole flight. I must have looked like I needed it. And one thing he said was, don't settle down until you go traveling with the girl for at least 1 week. Someplace that neither of you have been, you'll find out a lot. And thinking back, I think he must have just had a very bad experience. Like he's just got out of a bad marriage or something like that. But there's truth to it, and the stuff that we've been saying, just that I think you said that you look back at your life you see your life more objectively, and I think you're more responsible for the present. What you were talking about, that you don't. Every minute has to be negotiated, especially if you're with somebody. So where are we going to eat dinner becomes a discussion. There's nothing that happens reflexively. It is all new, and so that is the adventure.
There's the other story that you referenced that I can't remember the name of the specific drug, the malarial drug, but the other story in the collection that references that is Sophie Cunningham's, right? And she's got her story concludes with this lovely little phrase. She says, to give up to not knowing, to be uncertain of the name of things, that space is the place where possibility lives, and in my mind it shimmers as bright as a blue summer sky.
Oh, that's helpful.
It's lovely, isn't it? Just that idea that where you don't know where you're going in that space. Lovely. But for you, Stephen, you've lived in Melbourne for 10 years. Is that right? Yeah. But you've spent time in Japan. You're very widely travelled. I know it's a very big question, but how do you think that that sort of outlook and perpetual sort of that plan, how has that affected your life as a creative writer and the way that you write?
I think, well, much like Toni, who's written books set entirely in one place. I've written 2 books that are set in no place in particular, and I think possibly that's because both the way both books are constructed, they're from different stories that have been linked, and I think different stories had more American or Australian or even some Japanese influence, and it seemed, I don't want to say easier, but it seemed logical to not name a place. And I think this is, I always find it a big responsibility to name a place. That, if I'd said my first book, Things We Didn't See Coming, is a dystopian novel that goes forward about 30 years into the future, in successive chapters. And if I'd said, okay, this is Barcelona, or this is Melbourne, it would have been a much different book. And so to anchor something is a real responsibility to a kind of fidelity. And I suppose as an expatriate, I feel a little bit unanchored. So, and I heard this about Barry Unsworth, that his books fell off because he traveled too much and couldn't write about anywhere. And my heart sank. And I don't really want to be that, but I also like books that aren't set in a particular place. I'm thinking of Jose Saramago. Did anybody read Blindness? You all should go read Blindness. It's wonderful. But it's set in a non-specific place, and there's something about that can kind of lift the narrative away from the mundane. And sometimes if you're writing about a place, you're stuck with what that cafe looks and smells like. Whereas if you're making up a place that kind of serves as any Western, pseudo-Western, American, Australian, British city, you can get away with a bit more and leaves a bit more room for the reader to imagine.
For me, I think in Things They Didn't See Coming, I felt that it really lent a universality to the non-specificity meant that it was relevant to everybody everywhere, which I thought was really connected to the sort of post-apocalyptic feel that we're all kind of in danger in a way. Was that something that you set out to do, that it could apply anywhere? Or?
That's one of those things that happens conveniently later when you think, oh, this is why it works. It's the fortunate unconscious. There was definitely a portion with both books where they were published here first and then in the States, where editors wanted to de-Americanize or de-Australianize the text to the point that there was originally a squirrel in Things We Didn't See Coming that my editor Louis Swin said no.
No squirrels.
There's no squirrels. So there's a little bit of chickenness in terms of simply marketing a book. If it's not going to be a place, let's have it be no place, and let's stick with that story.
Huh. Yeah, there's two sides to that, I think. There was Tony's illustrated the other side, that you can set it very firmly in place. And it can be exotic to someone else, So I think that's really difficult. I thought originally with Pilgrimage that I wouldn't name Romania. I was thinking of J.M. Coetzee's Waiting for the Barbarians, where it's this mythical place. And yes, that's a fantastic book. And I thought, I'll do that too. But it got too hard because I had to say the city or the village. I couldn't actually put a name to anything, or else I had to make up a completely fake name, which just didn't seem to serve the point either. So in the end, I just thought, I'll just call it what it is, just... say what it is, but I think you could certainly vacillate on that point.
Whatever serves the narrative.
Yeah.
And I still feel like I haven't answered your question, because I think being an outsider, being for a prolonged period of time, is kind of an extension of what we've been talking about, and it just draws your attention to the things that are different. And it might be skewed, but there are things that I notice all the time in Australia that simply, there's some part of my brain that's like, oh, we don't do that back at home. And like bringing meat to a barbecue, that seems really strange to me. Like, we're all adults now. Can't somebody buy the meat and somebody make the salad? But this is something that Australians seem to do. But so just what your eye sees that's different.
And
you become a good noticer.
And I think you also are always measuring the difference between yourself and the place that you're in too. You sort of, is that how they would do it here? Is that how they would do it there? And where do I stand on that? Would I prefer it this way or that way? I think it's quite a useful a question to keep having in your mind all the time. There's I always bring it back to Scottish writers. I can't help it. But I think you've read Lanark, have you, Stephen? Yeah. Alistair Gray's Lanark. It's this beautiful dystopic Scottish novel. And in it he talks about how, Alistair Gray, the author, talks about how we imagine particular places and how we all inhabit places like Rome or Paris imaginatively, but nobody's imagined Glasgow in that particular way. And why not? And what happens to a city and the inhabitants of a city if they don't think creatively and romantically about the place that they're in, if those narratives can only ever play out somewhere else rather than the streets that they inhabit on a day-to-day
Is that why he wrote Lanark?
I think that's part of it. I think it is.
Well, I want to set a book in Glasgow, because I loved Glasgow.
Yeah, me too. Did the lady who was nodding about Kilmarnock? Yeah, she's still nodding. But it was part of that project. It was how can a country take its own literature seriously if you can't write imaginatively about the city you're in, if only those stories can play out in places that you're already kind of safe, that it's okay to imagine Paris, because everybody has a shorthand for what that means.
But for us as writers, I think there's a little bit of I'm not going to write a romance set in Paris. You are actually hampered by the known.
There's too much.
There's too much.
Yeah.
Tons of baggage.
What do you think about that, Toni, when you approached writing about Melbourne? And
Well, that's interesting. I suppose it seems that 15 years is a long time to live in a place, but I didn't grow up here. I didn't move here till I was 30.
You're from Brisbane?
From Brisbane. Yeah. And I'd come to Melbourne once for the weekend before I moved here. So in that respect, everything was new as well. It's like markets, trams, my goodness. So even the suburbs... I picked Richmond particularly. I didn't know it very well, and I had to do a lot of research. If I had have known how much research I had to do on the history of Richmond, because that book, my most recent book, is historical as well, and that's another place again. Even though I could go to Richmond now, imagining what Richmond was like in the 1940s was a completely different exercise. So it's about creating something in your head that is like what's real, but not quite real. And I chose Richmond because the family that I was talking about in this story had moved from, much like my family, had moved from working class to middle class in just a couple of generations. So much like my grandmother, who started in domestic service when she was 14, and my sister and I both went to university. So that's really an enormous jump in 2 generations. It's unprecedented. And I chose Richmond particularly because I wanted a suburb that had gone through that same transformation, and because I lived in Melbourne, I knew that Richmond was considered an absolutely horrible place back then. Really terrible slums, horrible diseases, high death rates of children. The Yarra ran red from the abattoirs around the edges of it. A really difficult place to live. And you go to Richmond now, it's mostly gorgeous, and I can't afford to buy a house there. So I wanted a place that reflected that movement, that societal movement that this family had been through. So the place is not for me accidental, and it's none of those suburbs that I've set the books have I lived in. It's been about a broader thing I'm trying to say, and that's why those places were the more relevant ones.
And so in the process for researching those books, then, did you go and spend time there, or did you sort of stay away and imaginatively inhabit it, or how did that all play out?
I went there, and I thought it was enough, and I did a draft, and I expected the normal editing meeting that you kind of get after you finish, and instead I just got a phone call that said, like, more research. So I had to go back and do everything again because I had everything wrong. I had the historical part particularly, I was amazed by the changes. I had bridges in the wrong place, I had schools in the wrong place, I had the feel of the streets just completely wrong.
Right.
So I walked the streets a lot more, and I had to actually set it. If I was going to set it in Richmond, I thought I had to know exactly where it was, exactly. So it's actually in Rowena Parade, which comes off Punt Road, runs from Punt Road. So I sort of walked up and down that street and imagined exactly which house. Now I know exactly which house it is.
Right.
And it's quite I really know that area very well, despite the fact I've never lived there.
Huh.
And, I would say to my husband, Robbie, do you want to go out for dinner? I'll buy dinner. And he goes, oh, no, Richmond again. And so, I quite feel like I know it now.
We Ian Rankin's in town this weekend for the Crime and Justice Festival, and we were chatting to him today, and he was talking about how when he wrote about Edinburgh, he was in France most of that time for the first sort of 4 or 5 Rebus books. Actually, he lived in France for 6 years, I think he said, and he was talking about how he had kind of created. In the beginning, he didn't name those places, and they were all sort of non-specific. But the more he wrote about them, the more obvious he felt that it was becoming that they were real places, until he eventually just named them. And then he said that had a whole other sort of effect, where people who drank in those pubs and who lived in those streets were then a bit resistant to that and felt a bit colonised by it. And partly for very practical reasons, that film crews would turn up and want to film at the pub, and they were off work, and there they were in the back, the back of the shot, having a pint or 2 in the afternoon. But he also said that he felt that he, in a way, probably couldn't have started writing about Edinburgh until he'd lived away from it.
Okay.
Do you think your experience in Beijing during that time has changed the way that you view Melbourne and how you write about home after that?
I'd be surprised, actually, if I set another book in Melbourne.
Really?
I feel like it was right for those 3 books, but now I think that I've had this experience. I really want to include a bit of that feeling, a bit of that being slightly unnerved, and, as you say, that space between what you know and what you don't know. So I want to capture that in another book, and I don't think I can capture that if I can just get on the train and go and check it out.
Right.
So, yeah.
Jacinta, for you, that space between what you know and what you don't know is quite important, isn't it? Because there's a very realist nature to the way that you write. Where do you think you'll continue to write in that vein? Will the next novel be I don't want to say
Okay.
autobiographical because that's not accurate.
Yeah,
I think you know what
well,
I'm getting.
I think you're right that I was thinking about it as Toni was talking about place, that I think for me the character story comes first. I have to have the characters and their internal story, and then I can put them in a place, and so I think the place is sort of secondary to me. So I suppose I think my writing's called moral realism or psychological realism. I always wanted to be a modernist writer, but I just guessed I'm not, you know. But so for me, it's really grounded in characters' sort of internal journeys, internal travel, perhaps. And then I think the place sits on top of that or around that. Though interestingly enough, I have a strong sense of place for the next book. And it won't be too far from Melbourne, but it will be a little bit removed from Melbourne, but somewhere I can probably travel to in an hour. So that's quite nice because it's a little bit out of my comfort zone, but yet I can come home for dinner.
It's great. What about you, Stephen? How are you approaching your... I think I'm breaking all the codes by asking you all to talk about future work.
Well, I can speak very theoretically, but I completely relate to place being secondary.
Yeah.
And I like I said, that I think if it serves, it's useful. If it doesn't serve, you don't need it. And I workshop with a writing group, and one of Michelle Ong Thin always says, "I don't have a sense of place here," and she writes place so beautifully. Her The Monsoon Broad is set in Sri Lanka, and it's absolutely gorgeous. Was it Burma?
I don't know.
I reckon Burma.
It's Burma. Sorry. In any case, it's beautiful, and she gets all of the setting right, and I feel that's often the stuff that I read past when I'm reading, because I want to find out what the characters are up to, who's lied, who's moved the knife, that sort of thing. And so there's a lot of window dressing and description. I don't care as much, and unless it's really beautiful and crisp and relevant, and ideally metaphorical in some way. But I am going into this next project probably going to find more or less what Toni found when she hit China, that this is not at all what I meant to write about, but I am thinking about a place and going there.
I thought it's really interesting though what you say about place being secondary, related to mentioning Saramago and how blindness, it's also in a kind of nowhere sort of place. I think it's to some degree it's just a habit of writing style. And I Waiting for the Barbarians is a wonderful example of that. It's a completely understandable situation and government and terrain, but it could be anywhere. And because you've read the back of the book, it's South African. It's kind of it's leaving the reader some things to picture. I find that a really interesting juxtaposition, though, that you worked for Fodders for 10 years and yet you're resisting any sort of pinning down to particular places or cities.
When you were talking about how living here for as long as you have, I still don't know if I could set a story in Melbourne, and I'm not even sure I could set a story in New York, even though I lived there for most of my adult life.
Yeah.
So I better get with
it. Is it because you think it would be somehow sort of... Is it that question of fidelity, that as soon as it's got a name, you feel responsible for representing it in a particular way? Or? Yes.
I feel like I wouldn't, at this point, there's the Colm Toibin book, Brooklyn.
Yeah.
I didn't read it, but I read a great review of it. And what it said that really stayed with me as an expatriate, and perhaps you can speak to this as well, is this idea that when you become an expatriate, you become a stranger in two lands at once.
Yeah.
And that kind of stabs me. And so I don't know how much expertise you need to write about the place you live in, or how long you need to be there to get this authority.
And sometimes it's too long, because I lived in China for a long time, 6 years, and any aspirations I had to ever write about that place, the more I learned about it, the more I felt unqualified to ever be able to talk about it, and it's a real hindrance,
Well, you sort of have to stick to the travelers, the Paul Bowles
the outsider
model. You're always going to be the outsider, and that's kind of how I'm approaching what I'm doing next.
David Mitchell writes really interestingly about that. He said about he spent a long time in Japan, and I think his wife is Japanese, and he said that there's some cultures that you can assimilate very quickly into, and there's others where you'll always be foreign, and he's always liked being in the always be foreign category for that reason, because you're always sort of he found that a very creative space to write from, because there's a gap between you and the everyday, but I can see how it would work the other way. You know?
There's a kind of built-in loneliness, and I left Japan because I thought, okay, there's a bamboo ceiling, for lack of a better. that I'm always going to be a gaijin. I'm never going to settle in, and I wasn't going to marry a local. Australia has a bit more room for me to be a stranger and to not be a stranger.
Well, we've got a bit of time for audience questions, so while you're scratching your heads and having a think, I might ask you just to nominate a couple of books of other people's that you think capture particular places really amazingly well, or maybe even for you, Stephen, the opposite, other books that are non-specific setting that are powerful for that reason.
Well, this is totally from left field, but I can't stop thinking about it. You probably all read it. I only just read it, last week, so I'm flabbergasted. It's taken this long. Carson McCullers, The Member of the Wedding, absolutely exquisite book. And for me, it was about place. It was this little southern town in summer, and how she incorporated that sense of the claustrophobia and the heat and the boredom into this beautiful story of a coming of age of this prepubescent girl wanting to travel. She wants to go to Luxembourg of all places. I thought that's the sort of thing I'd love to do. To incorporate place, a sense of place that's so much part of the main character and her view on the world. So I thought that was a fabulous book about place. Yeah.
I haven't read it as recently, so I can't speak as fully about it. But Michelle de Kretzer's The Hamilton Case, and I haven't read Rules of Travel, which is all about travel. Have you read it? You did read it. Yeah.
Sorry, no, you go.
Go.
You go. No.
It's great, and she writes plays.
Her new book, Questions of Travel, is just the best thing I've read all year, and it's these two stories of two different kinds of traveller. One a refugee travelling in desperation, and one a Australian woman with an inheritance travelling for pleasure or to find herself. Contrasting these two stories and the effects of travel it has on both their lives, and just completely magical. Which is really relevant for something you mentioned earlier, Stephen, about the privilege of travel and whether it's making us complacent. Or do you want to elaborate on that a little bit?
There's just a sort of there was a moment back in the green room where I think we were all talking about Venice or something, and I was just like, this is nice. It's a very first world conversation. Yeah. These people from different backgrounds and different experiences have all been to Venice, which is not that big, and just having this privilege of having this commonality and different places being reachable, and me being able to move here basically on whim. I was not a refugee. I left in the first Bush administration, but I was not a refugee. And so this is a different kind of living, and I wonder it's not my parents' generation, and I wonder what the future generation experience of this sort of close connectedness is or will be.
Right, do we have some? Yes, one.
Yes, this is a question for Jacinta. In fact, you chose a title that, of course, had been used before by others.
Yes, very famous book by Dorothy Richardson. Is that the one you're talking about?
I was talking about Paulo Coelho. I was talking about Pilgrimage by Paulo Coelho, but there are others anyway.
Yes, well, I haven't read Coelho's book, but and I haven't read Richardson's book either, come to think of it, but That was the one I was sort of thinking about. It was a very 7-volume book written early 1900s by a woman who sort of invented stream of consciousness, which was sort of a fairly impressive thing to do. And so I always had that idea in my mind when I was writing it, and I loved the title. It was really just a working title till the final sort of edit, where my editors said they were very happy with the title, so we kept it. But I like one-word titles, so that's my excuse anyway.
And it fits because it's an experience that so many people take, pilgrimages of all different types.
Exactly. Yeah, I think it's a word that it's common parlance, isn't it? I think we all do pilgrimages in lots of different ways, not necessarily religious, I suppose. And also the Spanish pilgrimage now, the El Camino, is very, very popular, isn't it? It's become a sort of not religious but sort of spiritual in some way. A lot of people are doing that for some spiritual reasons. Yeah.
Any more questions?
We've answered everything.
Yeah. Comments or reflections on travel? This one on the front.
I just can't let this go that my mother's family lived in Rowena Parade at the end in the 1930s and 40s, so I can't wait to buy your book.
It might be your house.
It's quite interesting because I've never done anything historical before, and I had the privilege this year of reading Wolf Hall. It's also just amazing book, and kind of thinking to myself, why did I choose something that's within living memory where people can find all my mistakes? Why didn't I just go a bit further back where I could make stuff up? So I'm kind of living in fear of somebody catching me out, and it might be you, madam.
But that's a whole other type of travel, isn't it?
Time
historical.
travel.
Did you have to get a special editor of a certain age and?
Well, actually,
knowledge?
I was quite lucky with this because I was lucky on a number of respects with the language. That my grandmother is still alive; she's 95, and she brought us up, so I was able to remember very clearly the language she used with us. And she's alive, so I can ask her questions. What would you say? What would you say? But there was a Queensland Victorian difference there that I had to account for. But my editor moved here to Australia when she was about, I think, in her teens, in I think the 70s, and so she had a clear idea of what was considered an Americanism because it was new to her. She remembers being surprised at some words that were not in normal use in the UK. So she had a pretty clear idea of what was currently in use, and a lot of words I had to look up, and surprising words like I had these 2 twin boys in the 40s, and I had them going to cricket training, because I think that's what you do, but of course it was never training. It was practice. It was always cricket practice. Training didn't come until the 70s. So writing historical fiction, you've really got to interrogate every single word for whether it belongs or not, and it's quite a grueling.
Yeah, that's it seems incredibly fraught. That's why
terrible.
I wouldn't. Everything was going fine until you said training.
Yeah.
and I think about Hilary Mantel as someone. This is not an undiscussed portion of English history that she's gone into. There's an expression I wouldn't use in front of a lot of people, but she went in quite forcefully, and to think that you can do that and not get caught. I haven't read anything detracting.
No, but David Mitchell actually talks about this in he's written this 1,000 Summers of Jacob. What's it?
Jacob de Zoet. 1,000 Autumns of Jacob de Zoet.
That's it. Thank you. I'm an enormous fan of David Mitchell, and he says that you can't actually make the language exactly the same because it's too foreign for our modern ear. And even going back, whether it's 50 or 100 years, the idea is to pick out a few representative things so it sounds kind of not now, but it doesn't sound as jarring as an actual accurate representation would be. And he calls this old-timese, and it's about creating like another language again.
But it's so difficult, it's so easy to get that wrong though, isn't it? Because one step too far and it's just cringeworthy and tightrope. Any more questions? Everybody's thinking very deeply about what you've said. Well, we'll leave it there then. Thank you so much to Jacinta Halloran, Steven Amsterdam, and Toni Jordan.